History repeats itself over and over during the course of human history. In modern American society, immigration has been a prominent issue, and we often think that our concerns with immigration are unique to this day and age of globalism and technology. The truth is, not only are the reasons for immigrants wanting to come to the United States very similar, many Americans' distaste for immigrants are based on the same things: fear of losing their jobs, their future, their culture, their religion, and their rights. The first wave of immigrants to come to the United States after the United States became a country was from 1840 to 1889. In just those 49 years, more than 14 million immigrants came into the country, most from Ireland, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Now, this is substantial since these immigrants couldn't just hop on a plane and cross the Atlantic. The Irish had to flee to the United States due to the potato famine, which was a terrible combination of a potato blight and pro-British, as in anti-Irish, policies in distributing food that led to starvation throughout Ireland. The Germans fled Europe after the revolutions of 1848. At the time, Germany was actually more of a series of separate states called the German Confederation, ruled by local monarchs who could really give a crap about the lower and middle classes. Germans were looking to minimize the power of these monarchs, looking for democracy and national unity. But Germans were also suffering economically with poor harvests, food shortages, and just mass unemployment. Though Germans made some gains in reform, especially in creating the Frankfurt Parliament in May 1848, ultimately the monarchs regained power. And the 48ers, as they called them, had to flee Germany ultimately because they faced political persecution and imprisonment once the monarchs regained power. They were labeled as traitors or rebels and basically could no longer live in Germany without being ruined. The United States offered opportunity and the democracy that these Germans were trying to push for in the German Confederation. They wanted freedom of speech, freedom of the press, free elections, and no monarchy. There were also economic prospects because at the time, the United States was still really relatively undiscovered land. The Native Americans would have a different opinion on that, but to a Westerner, undiscovered, untapped land full of potential. So there was a lot of economic prospects, and then there was the opportunity to buy land, and there were more jobs available as industry grew. These immigrants were white, so Americans welcomed them straight into the country, right? Nope. There was a large anti-immigrant movement called nativism. Americans had fears that were very similar to the anti-immigrant sentiments that exist today. Americans were afraid that the Irish and German immigrants would steal their jobs, lower the wages because they would work for less, crowd the cities, change American culture, and bring violent crime. Many in the nativist movement were Protestant also, and were afraid that the majority Catholic Irish and Germans would be loyal to the Pope instead of the United States. And they were afraid that they were going to undermine American democracy and try to impose Catholicism on our government and schools, which is kind of interesting because, evangelical Protestants are the ones doing that now. Most of the anti-immigrant vitriol was geared toward Irish immigrants since they were largely poorer and vying for those low-skilled, low-wage jobs that Americans also needed. Do you remember learning about the Know Nothing Party in school? This was a small but active political party, also known originally as the American Republican Party, and it was based almost purely on an anti-immigrant stance. The people in the Know Nothing Party were generally less educated and lower class, as well as Protestant and very anti-Catholic. They were called Know Nothings because they were responsible for a lot of political violence, and if caught would always say, "I know nothing." And of course, since they were largely uneducated, the party's critics called them Know Nothings because they thought they were stupid. The Know Nothings grew in power in the spring of 1854 when they swept the elections in Massachusetts. Robert T. Conrad ran officially as a Whig candidate, but later he revealed himself to be a know-nothing, which basically his campaign promised to crack down on crime, to close saloons on Sundays, and only appoint native-born Americans to office. These themes are very similar to today. He won the Philadelphia mayoral election by a landslide. After 1954, the Know Nothing Party became the American Party and grew in its official membership from 50,000 to over 1 million. So anti-immigrant sentiment was very big in the 1850s. The Know Nothing Party wanted to make becoming a citizen much more difficult for immigrants, and they supported extending citizenship waiting periods from 5 to 21 years. The Know Nothings also wanted to prevent immigrants from voting or from holding public office, and resorted to violence many times in order to block immigrants from voting. Baltimore is a prime example of this happening in the 1850s, especially during the Baltimore election riots of 1856. There was election violence throughout the country, but Baltimore was particularly bad. To set the stage, Baltimore was a wild political and urban atmosphere in 1856. They called it Mob Town. Nativists had the idea that immigrants would use their numbers and their voting power to put radical, pro-working, lower-class politicians into office. They feared this. There were even gangs by names of the Blood Tubs, the Wampanoags, and the Rip Raps that were affiliated with the Know Nothing and the Democrat parties. In 1850, 20% of Baltimore's population were immigrants, and by 1854, 25% were. That's a pretty big jump. Baltimore was also dubbed, like I said, Mob Town, because there was a prevalence for gang violence with a police force that really did nothing to stop it. Lots of corruption. Violence occurred nearly every election day because all of the polling places were only in the native-born districts. So immigrants had to travel into basically enemy territory to vote. And then votes were out in the open. There were no secret ballots. So there was always the incentive for voter intimidation. Can you imagine that? Both the Democrat and Know Nothing parties in Baltimore used propaganda pamphlets to encourage violence to get their politicians elected. And these pamphlets really worked to get their supporters just riled up. There were a series of riots in 1856 surrounding the elections in Baltimore. So by October the 8th, the actual election day, fevers were really high throughout the city. I'm talking, there were shootouts. They used cannons being shot in the streets, just violent attacks. Throughout 20 city wards, Democrats started riots to drive out the know-nothings with a huge shootout happening on Monument Street. Another notable riot happened when the know-nothing affiliated Rip Rap gang plundered the Democratic New Market Fire Company firehouse in the Lexington Market area. During national and state elections on November the 4th, Baltimore Mayor Swan ordered the Maryland Light Division of Infantry to be out on standby in case of the inevitable violence, but he never used the division. People throughout the state did not believe that the elections were going to be fair, and they had reason to believe that. And that set off tensions and violence. In the 6th Ward, a mob fired a cannon at police. In the 2nd Ward, Democrats threw out the know-nothings from the polling stations. Just, nope, can't vote, get out of here. 67 people were injured and 17 died throughout the election riots. Somehow, and most likely with a lot of gang interference, Know Nothing candidate Millard Fillmore won in Baltimore, earning him his only electoral college votes for that election. Now, Millard Fillmore had been president previously, but only because Zachary Taylor died in office and he took over because he was vice president. He was not popular. While anti-immigrant tendencies have been in politics since the Know Nothing Party, the party largely died out just a few years after the riots. The Know Nothing Party's platform was almost entirely anti-immigrant, and slavery quickly became a much more contentious issue for the United States. The party itself was divided between Northern and Southern members, and they just could not take a clear stance on whether or not to abolish slavery. Many Know Nothing Party members joined the Republican Party in 1854 because it opposed slavery as the United States expanded into its new territory. They were, basically that was one of the big questions as the United States expanded and had more states. Was slavery going to be legal in those new states? The Know Nothings were also known for being very violent, and most people were fleeing that kind of voter intimidation that they were doing. So a lot of people just were against that. And finally, immigrants became more politically organized as Irish and German immigrants gained citizenship because it only took 5 years of a waiting period to become a citizen. In fact, Irish and German immigrants became some of the most powerful political groups in large cities such as New York, Boston, and Baltimore. What makes this period in American history notable is not just the scale of immigration, but the reaction to it. Many of the same concerns voiced in the 1850s about jobs, culture, religion, political influence, and national identity have appeared repeatedly in different forms throughout American history. Irish and German immigrants were once widely viewed as incompatible with American society. Political parties formed around restricting their rights, and violence was used a lot to try to limit their political participation. And yet, over time, those same immigrant communities became fully integrated into American civic, economic, and political life. Their presence did not weaken American democracy, it became a part of it. This pattern has repeated itself across different immigrant groups in different eras under different circumstances. Understanding how Americans responded to immigration in the past doesn't tell us what conclusions to draw today, but it does provide important context. It reminds us that immigration has long been a source of both tension and transformation, and that debates about who belongs in America are not new, but part of the country's ongoing story. President Trump has been in his second term since January 20th, 2025. So Barry Siegel is an American journalist and former national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. He won the